welcome to episode 102 of the CRICKETher Weekly.
It's like room 102, Raf.
No, Sid. As Claire Jenkins points out, you missed the opportunity for that joke last week.
Yeah, but room 102 is just like room 101, but worse.
Okay.
It's like one worse.
Are you trying to get people really stoked for this episode?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, we've got two big topics of discussion this week. We're going to start by talking about the 100, because this week we've had some big announcements, because the teams have announced which players that they are going to be retaining. Sid, can you give us a little bit of the lowdown on that?
Yeah, so there's a sort of we're going again with the open market process. So basically, it means negotiations are carried out behind the scenes, and the teams are negotiating with people and saying, I want to keep you, and but obviously players are also negotiating, informally and more formally with other teams and going, well, I'd like to come to you, if you can give me the right spot. So we've had an announcement today with just the players that are going to stay with their teams. Sorry, last week, not today. And yeah, so there's been some big differences actually. So Birmingham Phoenix, for example, if I can just pull up the numbers here in front of me, because it's hard to remember these things sometimes. Birmingham Phoenix have kept almost all their squads. They've kept 12 players, so only 3 spots remaining open.
And they were partly because they were successful last year.
Yeah, they got to the semi-final last year.
The Eliminator.
But in contrast, the Rockets have fired almost all of their squad into space.
Hopefully not literally.
They've retained just 5 players,
Okay.
including the sort of the key access, if you like, of Nat Siver and Catherine Brunt. But they're going to be looking for 10 new players. So some big differences there, and also some big differences in what people have done with their overseas players. So, the Spirit, for example, have got rid of all 3 of their overseas players, and they'll be bringing in 3 different players, which gives you a real good opportunity to change things up. Whereas Oval Invincibles, perhaps unsurprisingly, the other side of London, have kept all 3 of their big overseas players. So Ismail, Van Neerkerk and Cap are all staying, and why not, given the success from last year. So yeah, that was.
I was just going to say, I think that's really interesting because we didn't really have this system in the Kia Super League, did we? We didn't have such a totally open market system.
Yeah, you had sort of players almost being appointed by England, and England were very careful to try and ensure that the best players in the England stars were kind of parcelled out. Whereas it'd be interesting to see how much that's happening this time. Welsh Fire, of course, who didn't have a great season last year, have currently got none of the big England players, but of course a couple of England players that are free agents, so to speak. They've not been allocated yet. So Tammy Beaumont has moved on from Spirit, and Lauren Winfield Hill as well, who's actually that's kind of an interesting one in itself, really, because Lauren Winfield Hill has been Yorkshire through and through for so long, but she looks like she's not going to be playing for the Yorkshire Superchargers, as they're not called.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Obviously, the advantage in some ways of the open market is that from a player perspective, maybe you can negotiate for a higher fee. So it may well be that Lauren Winfield Hill has been offered more money to go elsewhere, perhaps, and that she's taken that. So fair enough, kind of player power. But the downside of having this open market, of course, is if you're Welsh Fire and you're one of the teams who's really struggled in year 1, then you go, okay, well, we need a wholesale new squad. So you kind of ditch a lot of your existing players, as you were saying there. Some of the teams have done that. But then you're not really left with anybody wanting to come and play for you because you've got this established reputation as not being a very successful side.
Yeah, the reputation did establish itself very quickly, didn't it, in that sense? And also, of course, all the teams have kept all their very best players.
Yes,
so,
exactly.
Unsurprisingly, the Oval Invincibles have, kept Alice Capsey.
Yeah, so Welsh Fire
aren't
going to be able to just go, oh well, we've decided that we need the best bowler in the world, so we're going to go after Marizanne Kapp, because she's not going to be like, oh yeah, I'll go to Welsh Fire, when she can claim a top salary at Invincibles. So I think that makes it much harder for the teams who have done worse in the first year to actually fight back from that.
Yeah, and the teams though do have it. The positive side is that there's an opportunity to refresh, right? And I looked at this in a piece on CRICKETher this morning, so you can go and have a look at that. I looked at some numbers from last year and looked at where teams were strong and weak last year. The really interesting thing that stood out among the teams itself was actually Oval Invincibles. I guess that if we sort of said, they feel like they're a bowling team, and certainly in the final they suggested they were a bowling team, as Marizanne Kapp, kind of took out Southern Brave all by herself.
Yeah.
But the stats really emphasise just how much they're a bowling team. That in fact their batting was a bit of a disaster area. In some ways, the weakest team in batting. Now, have to be slightly careful with these stats because they don't tell you the whole picture, but they do tell you quite a lot. And if a team's coming last in a sort of measure of various different batting stats, all amalgamated together, and there's like 144 different numbers that have gone into these stats. If a team's coming last, that really tells you something.
Yeah.
So, they need to go out and really kind of strengthen their batting a bit, because their risk, of course, is that, they might have the big game players, but if you don't make the semi-finals, if you don't make the top three, then you don't get a chance to play that big game.
So what's more important, Sid, batting or bowling?
Well, this is another interesting question, more overall, isn't it? It's like, we always talk about superstar batters in T20, don't we? And the 100 is basically T20. But, how much difference does a superstar batter really make? So Jemima Rodriguez was the star batter, the outstanding batter by numbers, and in terms of what she actually did. I think everyone would agree with that from the first edition of the 100. But she was not able to prop up Northern Superchargers batting sufficiently. They only came like fifth in the sort of batting numbers that I looked at. And they obviously didn't qualify for the knockout stages. They didn't make that top three. Whereas having the star bowlers does look like that there might be something to that, doesn't it? It's something that so there's an Australian gentleman called Chris Brooker, not the guy that does the sci-fi TV thingies, but he's an Australian journalist. Who's worth a follow on Twitter, and he's talked about this for quite a long time now, about the importance of bowling, and he's obviously focused on WBBL, for example, and gone, look, bowling's really key in that. And I think you were seeing it again here. It's one of those things that you start to see everywhere once someone mentions it to you, and I think it's becoming clear that bowling is a critical part of the whole T20 makeup, and perhaps as kind of selectors and things, we're underestimating the value of bowling, and we should be paying our star bowlers more, which is what the Oval Invincibles are doing.
Well, I think it's, to some extent, there are more world-class batters in the women's game than there are bowlers, I think.
Maybe.
So if you look at, so for example, this month's edition of Wisden Cricket Monthly magazine, they've got a feature.
Available now in all good news agents.
Yeah, I think it's the top 22 women's players in the world they settled on eventually, and we both contributed to that list. It seems to me, I haven't actually done the numbers on this, but it feels like it's more batter heavy than it is bowler heavy. So it's almost like batters it's easier to be a world-class batter than it is to be a world-class bowler. I can feel all the batters in the world hating on me right now. I do think the shorter the format, so obviously the 100 is the shortest format that we've got, the more important it is to have better, like a real top-class lineup of bowlers than batters, because the batters, none of them get to bat for as long, whereas the bowlers still really have to turn it on with every ball that they bowl.
Yeah, and you still need to try and take wickets.
Yeah.
If you don't take wickets, ultimately you're not going to win the game again. So, yeah. Anyway, so there's lots to look forward to in the 100. There's going to be some announcements over the next few months. Obviously, we've kind of we don't have a lot of behind-the-scenes information, because I'm surprised, for obvious reasons, we haven't really spoken to very many players over the last few months, have we? Outside very controlled conditions of press conferences.
I did want to say something about the salaries, though.
Oh, yeah, okay, go on, Raf, talk about the salaries.
Well, obviously one of the things that's happened this week because they've announced all of the men's retentions as well, and so they've tweeted these graphics of the men's lineups and the women's lineups, and they've done it because you need to know where the gaps are for how, for your analysis, you need to know how much each player is being paid. So they're being very open about how much money each individual player can command. And actually, almost for the first time, they're kind of lining up those men's salaries against the women's salaries directly. And kind of it becomes really obvious when you tweet the graphic of the women's and the men's at the same time that the bottom men are still only just earning less than the top women. So there has been a pay rise. So the women's top bands this year are going to be 31,250, and the bottom men's bands are 30,000. But that's still kind of ridiculous to think that the top women are only just earning more than the bottom men. And I just think it's really interesting the way that, because they're being so open about the salaries, you can do that direct comparison. And one of the bugbears I've always had with the way that the ECB have handled the central contracts, the England women's central contracts, is they haven't been open about how much they're worth. and we've had to kind of guess and read between the lines. A lot of people have overestimated how much they're worth. And I think that they've done that deliberately in order to avoid people being able to say, oh, well, Heather Knight earns this much, but Joe Root earns this much, etc. Whereas in the 100, you can't escape from that. You see what everyone's earning, and you go, well, hang on a minute. How is it possible that Elise Perry's earning 25,000 and she's earning less than? I can't even remember any of the names because I've literally not heard of any of the men. You can't pretend
that Elise Perry is not better known than every one of the men that are in the bottom band of the men's.
I'm sorry, and no offence, and that's, and in a way that's why when I tweeted about this, I didn't pick on any of the men individually because I'm sure they may be very nice people and they may be very good cricketers. I have no idea who they are, but that says it all, doesn't it? I mean, there can't be very many people who follow cricket who have not heard of Elise Perry. Or Alice Capsey as well was one of the standout stars, men or women, from last year's competition, and she's only earning 15,000. So she's earning half of what one of those random men is earning. So it's just, I just think it's a bit crazy, and we've obviously talked about the disparities before, and the ECB are trying to say, oh well, we're narrowing the gap and everything like that, but it still looks really appalling.
I suspect that when we do the pie chart again this year, and we will do that pie chart again, which shows that the whole value of the salaries, I suspect that it's still going to look pretty much like last year's, that the men will still be eating the vast majority of the salaries, even though things have changed a bit. So I think the women have gone from a small piece to a slightly less small piece. Okay. Anyway.
Right, well, there's another big topic, Sid, that we were going to talk about this week.
I thought we were done with this week.
There's actually quite a big tournament starting in a few days' time, Sid.
It's not a few days, there's a couple of months until the 100 starts at least, right?
No. I'm talking about the World Cup.
Wow. There's a World Cup?
There is. It's starting on Friday. So it's very exciting, and we've actually had the first warm-ups have happened now because the teams have been out of quarantine for a bit and had a few days rest and relaxation. What's been happening in the warm-ups, Sid?
It's been some interesting results. Maybe I don't know how much you read into it. So South Africa just about beat India. That was a pretty close game. I think that probably reflects on about where they're going to be in the tournament. I think that that they're quite close to each other as teams. Australia hammered the West Indies. Unsurprising. Yeah. New Zealand lost to Pakistan.
Oh, what happened there?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that
I think it's the curse of Raf. I'm afraid. I've now publicly backed them about 3 times to win the World Cup, and now they've gone and lost to Pakistan in the warm-up.
Yeah, I mean, but I wouldn't necessarily read too much into any of those results, to be honest. South Africa wins today doesn't mean they're going to beat India in the tournament. Okay. And a West Indies loss today doesn't mean they're not going to have a big impact on the tournament as well. So, it's good that the teams are finally getting out there. They're out of quarantine, and we're looking forward to the first match. First match on Friday. Well, what time is that in sort of English money, Raf? Is it Friday night, Saturday morning?
I think it might be 1 a.m. on Friday. The first match starts.
So it's like Thursday night, effectively.
Well, it's Friday morning, strictly speaking, but yeah, it depends whether you stay up late or you try and snatch a few hours and then get up very early.
You pay your money and you take your choice.
Yes.
It's going to be a tough few weeks, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anyway, if you found us going slightly mad in about 4 weeks' time on this show, then
we'll just get progressively bigger bags under our eyes with each podcast that we record.
We've got big enough bags under my eyes already, Raf.
All right, well... Anyway, there's been a crazy new rule announced this week, hasn't there, Sid?
Yeah. So, talking of the warm-up games, we often criticise warm-up games, or we kind of make fun of them for being a bit jumpers for goalposts, as they, allow people to bat twice and allow 15 players to field and all this kind of thing. But it seems like we're going to actually get one of those rules for the World Cup proper, right, Raf? Due to COVID.
It's absolutely insane, isn't it? So they've said because of concerns that COVID might really hit teams quite hard, despite the fact that they've got 2 or 3 COVID replacements already, that they're going to allow teams to take to the field with 9 players who are named in the squad, plus 2 females from the management. So like your team doctor or your team physio or your team psych, if any of them are women, then or your coach, you can get them on the field. So, for example, apparently we may see England playing with Lisa Kitely in the outfield. Suppose, to be honest, for England that wouldn't be such a bad choice because she's at least played international cricket once upon a time. It's utterly bizarre. it to be honest, it makes a mockery of the whole thing. It really does. And it's one thing doing that in warm-ups, but these are meant to be full internationals. It's the World Cup, it's the premier tournament for women's cricket. It's just crazy.
But aren't they just making the best of a bad deal, Raf?
Well, yeah, I suppose, to some extent. The other thing that I wanted to say was that it could be gamed by teams, this rule. So, if I'm Meg Lanning, I may well be sat there going, oh, hang on a minute. Actually, maybe not Meg Lanning, because Australia have got... Australia don't really have any hangers-on in their squad. But if you've got somebody who you're going, because potentially what happens is if somebody... the two substitutes are not going to be able to bat, are they? So we don't actually know how this is going to work. So we're just sort of guessing to some extent. But if it's still going to be 10 wickets, then that means that 2 of your players are going to be able to bat again, right?
Potentially, yeah.
They haven't
said in detail how.
Are going to be able to bat again. So let's say Tammy Beaumont comes out and makes a century for England, then gets out, then she's going to be able to come back out and bat again in the same match. So she's totally tuned in to the pitch conditions and everything like that. And so if you're England, you might be sat there going, oh, hang on a minute. Well, if we've got a number 11, maybe we should just switch in Lisa Kitely. We'll just say that person's got COVID and we just switch in Lisa Kitely. And that gives us more of an advantage by just having somebody in the outfield for a few overs to field. That doesn't outweigh having Tammy Beaumont being able to bat twice. Do you see what I'm trying to say here?
We're 8 wickets down in the 45th over, and we've suddenly discovered that 4 of our players have failed COVID tests.
Oh, it's such a shame. But do you see what I mean? That's why it's stupid. And you just asked me whether they're making the best of a bad situation. Yeah, I mean, I guess, but I'm going to say something a bit controversial here, Sid. They should have had the World Cup a year ago when it was originally scheduled for. And the reason they should have had it a year ago was because what's now happening is that it's being held at precisely the wrong time when COVID is now being allowed to run rampant through a New Zealand population that has no immunity, or the only immunity they have is through vaccination.
They've got good vaccination rates.
They have got good vaccination rates, yes, but nobody's had it, right? So it's wreaking havoc through the population. Loads of people are getting it because the vaccination doesn't stop you from getting it. It stops you from getting it severely.
Almost everyone we know that's had Omicron has been vaccinated.
Yeah, right. So it doesn't. Yeah, the vaccination doesn't stop you getting it. It stops you getting it severely. Okay. So, it's running havoc through your population. If you'd held it a year ago, the teams are still having to quarantine now. And they're now saying that there's going to be very few crowds, if any, able to attend. Well, a year ago, England were in New Zealand having a great time because it was normal life. Yes, they obviously had to do the quarantine, but once they got out the other side, everything was fairly normal, and they were able to have crowds at their matches, and it was just played in relatively normal conditions. If we'd had the World Cup then, things would have actually felt quite normal. So there's that. The other thing is that I do think that the ICC really should have sat down when COVID hit and gone, hang on a minute, we need to change the way that the tournament's being played, because one of the high risk things with the way that the tournament's being set up is that the teams have got to be on the move constantly. So they're moving between, they're flying between...
creates opportunities to...
contract COVID, so they're flying between the North and the South Island every other day. They're on a flight, they're going to a different hotel, they're going to a different ground. And obviously that was done for political reasons initially, because you want your World Cup matches to be shared between lots of different high-profile grounds, don't you?
Yeah.
Okay, but when the pandemic hits, the ICC should have sat down with the organising committee and gone, look guys, I'm really sorry, but this is a not ideal situation and we need to minimise the chances of COVID getting into this World Cup. So we're going to make it so that it's all in one place. A bit like the 2000 World Cup, the last one in New Zealand. They were all in, it was all played at one ground. They were all in the same accommodation, all of the teams. And yes, now we would look back at that and go, oh, hang on a minute, that was the pre-professional era, things look very different. But that would be the way to minimise the chances of COVID. You won't have to be having these stupid concerns about playing 9 players and having Lisa Kitely play on the outfield. No offence, Lisa Kitely, but whoever else, like your random team doctor, playing, fielding for you. If you'd actually played the tournament, either played it a year ago or kind of played it in a more COVID safe way, rather than feeling that you have to adhere to a model that you conceived of pre-pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, okay, well...
Sorry, that was a bit of a rant there.
The tournament is going to be what it is, Raf.
It is.
So what's going to happen? Okay, shall I tell you my prediction for the... Who do you think are going to make those quarterfinals? Shall I tell you my predictions for the quarterfinalists?
You mean the semi-finals?
Yeah, the semi-finals, yeah, sorry.
Okay, who's going to be in the semi-finals?
So I think it's pretty much guaranteed, really. It's going to be Australia, New Zealand, England, India and South Africa. I think they'll make the semi-finals, those teams.
But that's 5 teams, Sid.
Well, that makes it... That's a bit awkward, isn't it,
Do you
Raf?
think people can tell when we've pre-prepped a joke, Sid? Because I think that they probably can.
Oh, no. It's not... These are the finest dad jokes that you'll hear on any cricket podcast.
Okay,
anyway.
So obviously the point that you're trying to make there is there's 5 teams who are fighting it out for those 4 semi-final positions.
Yeah, so seriously, who's not going to make it, Raf? Well, who do you think was not going to make it out of those 5?
Well, it's a big call, whichever way round you have it. And to be honest, I'm tempted to say New Zealand now, purely because I've put the mockers on, so I need to put the anti-mockers on them. But I think I'm going to have to say India.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I think it is going to be very close. I mean, that India-South Africa match I mentioned earlier in the warm-ups, I think was indicative of what it's going to be. So I feel what's going to happen in the group stages, Australia will run away with it. I think that Australia will probably win every game. So they'll be, massively out in front. And then it's going to be a question of those, second, third, fourth and fifth, and who gets those second, third and fourth places to make that. And it's going to be close. It's going to be tight. Ben Gardner said something really interesting in the Wisden weekly podcast. He was pointing out about the West Indies. He was like, the West Indies, they're not going to make those semi-finals, but they're going to have a big say in who does, because they're going to be the team that causes the upset, that beats somebody. So you can just see the West Indies, causing an upset, beating India, for example, and then that could crush India's hopes, because that's going to be such a crucial game. So in some ways, the West Indies games are going to be really important, because they'll be the ones to win, because the West Indies are the team capable of causing that real upset, I think.
Or Pakistan as well could
yeah.
play a similar role. We've just been talking about them beating New Zealand in the warm-up, so I think
you
that
certainly
teams
can't afford to slip up there.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas in 2017, Pakistan were definitely very much kind of one of the weak links. I can't remember if it was they or Sri Lanka who took home the wooden spoon in the end.
Sri Lanka did in the end.
Okay, but it feels like this time around that Pakistan maybe could play that similar role to West Indies. We're not talking about them getting to the semis, but playing it's not going to be an easy ride against either of those teams. You got to be on your guard. So that's really interesting. And then so Australia are going to march through the group stages, but then Australia in a semi-final against New Zealand maybe could be really interesting. The semi-finals, presumably it's going to be 1v3 and 2v4.
1v4.
1v4 and 2v3, sorry. Yeah.
So,
okay.
Yes, there's also going to be a big challenge of kind of not coming fourth. You want to try and be second or third to avoid Australia.
Exactly, and you've said quite often that England's biggest hope of winning the World Cup this time is for somebody else to knock Australia out in the semis. That's happened last time.
Yeah.
India knocked them out. So I think that could be quite interesting. I think there's something about an Australia-New Zealand contest, and I remember this in the T20 World Cup in 2020, because I think people often don't remember this, but that Australia-New Zealand match was effectively a quarter-final, because if Australia had lost that, then they wouldn't have progressed to the semis.
Yeah.
And obviously would never have got to the MCG, and they really came quite close to losing. There was definitely a point, because we were watching it in a pub, I think, there was definitely a point at which I was like, ooh, it's going to get interesting.
It didn't quite, but it could definitely happen. We've seen, what match winners New Zealand have. I mean, Amelia Kerr's, now, her run of games, she's scored 50 in 4 consecutive games or something.
I think so.
So she's obviously in top form, and Susie Bates back in form. In fact, in terms of their big players, it's Sophie Devine that's still looking for a big score now. So
dangerous.
Yeah.
And one other thing that's really interesting about the way that this discussion's framed is actually, and I think a couple of people have made this point, so it's maybe not a very original point, but actually the pressure is all on Australia as the massive favourite, rather than on England as defending champions. Heather Knight's actually come out and said, we're not really feeling any pressure in the way that you normally would as defending champions, because in a way, we don't expect England to win, do we?
No, I think nobody expects anybody except Australia to win.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, and that can sometimes play mind games with people. And I know that in 2020 Australia really struggled with that favourites tag, and because of all of the PR around, oh well, we'll see Australia at the MCG on 8th of March, etc. So you
Maybe
never
a
know.
little bit less pressure this time because it's not the home final that
that's
everybody
true.
wanted. But yeah, pressure's on Australia. But you know, at the end of the day, I think we both agree that, you know, if you're going to put money on, put it on Australia, right, Raph?
Yeah, but don't bet because it's bad.
No.
Right, I think we better wrap it up there, Sid. Let's look forward to some sleepless nights, and hopefully it won't be as boringly predictable as we've just said in terms of Australia winning. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Bye for now.
Bye.